have some people at our holiday special, hopefully.
So good, yeah.
And no reverb this time, too.
Nice.
Knock on wood. So
I don't know how that happened last week. I don't know what was going on. I don't know if it was my computer or everyone else's computer, but yeah, I'm happy it's not this week.
It was so strange. I think there was just something about like the playback, and it was echoing through, and it was very distracting there for a few minutes. I mean, as I said on Twitter, like it's like free extra vocals. That's our service to our viewers, is where you can hear us more than once.
Yeah.
So,
but I'm glad that people are still watching the YouTube because the episode, because it was a really, really informative episode. I mean, I learned so much.
Yeah, it was a phenomenal episode. I'm really excited. I think we are going to do another episode with Uncle Nearest again. Tracy Franklin, who was joining us, she even suggested some other themes, talking about rum, for example, which we talked a little bit about with Jordan, because rum was kind of the staple of the early Atlantic world. The development of whiskey, specifically focusing on the period around when Nearest Green was alive. And then I think Tracy has a background in cocktails, so she really wanted to do a cocktails episode as well. And the history of cocktails is a phenomenal and fascinating thing to talk about as well. So.
Yeah, we could convince Eric Rauchway back on the show to talk about tiki bars and tiki cocktails.
I don't think that would be a problem. Eric seemed to enjoy himself. So
yes.
That is something we could talk about this episode is who is our favorite and who is our worst guest. But no, we shouldn't do that actually, because they've all been phenomenal.
We should do worst guests, so. But they've all been amazing. But I think like when we started it was like initially really scary, at least for me. I don't know if you were scared. I was incredibly scared because one, you're lining up all these guests and we're convincing, like, and I was like, oh God, I got to talk to Kevin Cruz for half an hour. Like that is, this is like panic mode.
How could we possibly fill a half an hour with conversation? And then all of a sudden it became an hour, and like every time we're just like, oh crap, like we need to stop because we just could keep going for longer. So.
I almost when we got Joanne Freeman on the show, I was like, oh my God, how am I not going to faint? Because I'm so close to fainting. She was so cool.
I know. And everybody's been so great and so excited and so welcoming about this. And we've had such phenomenal feedback. I mean, it's kind of crazy that this is our 24th episode, if you can believe that. And, just from something starting, and I guess it's kind of a way of kicking off is just to remind everybody. I mean, this just started with like a Twitter exchange between us, in which I think Varsha, you were the initiator. You just said like, wouldn't it be great to just kind of do like a Twitter story and like Zoom talks? And then I thought, like, because I'm a terrible person, is like, let's drinks while we're doing it. And then we just started talking, and then it was like you said, like we used to email like random people, that we didn't like. I didn't really. I'd met Kevin Cruz once before, and I was like, hey Kevin, would you be interested in this? And he's like, sure, that sounds fun. And everybody that we've emailed has just been like, this is great. I'm more than happy to do it. I'm so excited to do that because we're just trying to have kind of a fun conversation about history and just kind of have a drink while we're still stuck in our houses forever. But
I think that's basically where it started. I tweeted it out mainly because I was sort of losing it during quarantine, because I was studying for comps, and once comps was over, I couldn't go to any talks anymore. Seminars weren't in person, so I was like, man, I miss the feeling of like reading a book and then going to a talk about that book and being like, these are all the questions I have. And I realized that there's like a ton of other historians who are still writing books, somehow managing to still write books during a pandemic. Maybe we should talk to them. And then we've also had such great discussions about pedagogy, like when we had Kevin on, and thinking about how while the liberal university is crumbling around us, thinking about how to maintain proper college education, proper high school education of history has been like a really fascinating discussion. So,
and that's amazing too. I mean, I think there is, like you said, I mean, with all the terrible announcements, University of Evansville, University of Vermont, Marquette, like cutting, this crisis in the academy. And then on top of that, oftentimes you hear very justified sometimes about how kind of terrible academics can be, both to outside people, but also to one another. It's nice that there are pockets of really good people who care very deeply about what they're working on, but also care very deeply about sharing that and think that it has like an impact on people, and it does have an impact on people. I mean, like if anything, has taught us over the last 2 years is that history matters. Like it informs decisions, political, social, cultural today. And yeah, we could kind of go on together.
Yeah.
But we've been rambling a little bit. I think we need to start drinking. So let me ask you, Varsha, what are you drinking today to kick off our holiday special? Do you have any recommendations for our viewers?
Yes. So I'm not drinking 4 bottles, but I'm going to recommend 4 bottles. I'm going to start with what I'm drinking, which is the recommendation, which is Widow Jane, aged 10 years. So it's like a lesser known bourbon, but it's still like amazing. So basically, if you enjoy vanilla and if you enjoy like caramel and like cherry in your bourbon, like obviously it's not overpowering, but this is like a much more sweeter bourbon than you're used to, and that's why I really like it, because I enjoy sweet bourbons. That's why I like Woodford Reserve. So Widow Jane is really, really good. So that's what I'm drinking today. I'm drinking it neat because it's my favorite thing to do. But another bourbon I would recommend, if you like, again, on the sweeter side, but also if you like the fact that you can smell the vanilla in your bourbon, this is the first bourbon I've ever had. I had it at a bar in DC 3 or 2.5 years ago. It was in the summer, and it was a bar called Bourbon and Chicken, or Chicken and Bourbon in DC. Basically, they serve chicken on the front of the bar, and in the back they only serve whiskey. And this is the first bourbon I tried, and it's delicious. So this one is like, it's a little bit spicier, but it's like, it has like a lot of toffee flavors. You can sort of like tell like the clove is in there. Again, I'm new to this, but that's sort of what I taste in there. It's really good. And then obviously,
That's
because
Willet
I started
Pot
off,
Still? Sorry?
yeah, Willet Pot Still.
Okay.
Willet Pot Still. And then obviously, because I started off as a Scotch person, I'm going to recommend 2 Scotches. The first is the Balvenie. So this is the 12-year one, Balvenie 12-year, and it is it's aged in American oak barrels. So that's why it's like a little bit sweeter than than other Scotches, but it's really, really like, it's not peaty, unlike most Scotches. That's why people don't really like Scotch, but it does still have that kick. That's why I like this one, Balvenie 12. And then the first, this is one of the first Scotches that I tried. I tried the Oban 14, but this is another bottle that I found. It's called Oban Little Bay, and it's basically like the Oban 14, but it's a little bit spicier, and there's like a little bit more cinnamon in it. So Oban Little Bay, Balvenie 12, Willet Pot Still, and Widow Jane. And today I'm drinking Widow Jane, but if you are looking for a gift for somebody, or you want to try out bourbons and scotches during this holiday season because you can't go out and see your family and you want to be warm by the fire, these are the 4 that I would recommend.
Yeah. And you have a spreadsheet, I think.
Oh yeah.
Like, so you're very serious about your whiskey. I don't think our viewers actually understand that. I mean, we've talked about this several times, but
I'm very serious. So when I first got into it, I think I told the story last week. I've sent the document out to people. Everybody can see it. When I first got into it, it was because I won a bet. And when I won this bet, it was a bottle of Johnnie Walker Blue Label. And I had no idea what whiskey tasted like, because the only whiskey I'd had before that was a glass of Jack Daniels my freshman year of college. And I was like, never again will I drink whiskey, because you have to be sort of experienced to drink Jack Daniels, oddly enough, because it's not like, it wasn't a high quality Jack Daniels bottle. Let's just say that. It was like the one that everybody drinks. And so I stayed away from whiskey. And then when I got this bottle, I had to teach myself how to drink it. And so as I was teaching myself how to drink it, I recognized, oh my God, I love Scotch. And so I'd go to new bars, and whenever I went to a new bar, I would try a new bottle. I'd try a glass of a new bottle, and I realized I should start keeping track of this. And so when I got to DC, that's when I started keeping track of it, because there's this bar in DC called Jack Rose Dining Saloon, where they have hundreds of bottles of whiskey on the wall. Hundreds of bottles. I think it's in the Georgetown area. I think that's what the area is called. And also DC has a bunch of other whiskey bars as well, and so does San Francisco. So before COVID, that's what I would do. And then also a little bit of an embarrassing story, but how I deal with it. Whenever I had to go on a first date, I would always choose a bar, not because I intended to get drunk, but because even if the date went bad, I could show up early, order what I wanted, and at least I'd leave the experience with a new taste. So that's why I started keeping track of everything. Actually, there was one person at this bar that I went to. It was in Berkeley. It was in a speakeasy type bar. And this person had this little notebook with them where they were noting down stuff after they ordered this glass of Japanese whiskey. And I was like, what are you doing? And he's like, I have to keep track of everything I drink because there's so many things. And like, I have to buy all of them, but I can't buy all of them. So I realized I should start keeping track as well. So I've shared document with anybody, and that's what I'm drinking. But Matt, you've been the cocktail person, and so
I
you're
have
making
been.
a cocktail. So
I
what are
am.
you drinking today?
I am a fancy boy. So I'm gonna make a cocktail tonight. And I think that cocktails kind of scare people because, or maybe they don't. I mean, they always scared me, right? Because I had this image is that like, okay, you got to get the proportions just right. You have to have the very specific things and stuff like that. How am I going to get the materials I need and stuff and all that kind of thing? And they're really not that intimidating. So I'm gonna make an old fashioned, and I'm gonna kind of just share kind of a couple tools that you might need, and they oftentimes come together. And if you want to just kind of start to build a bar, start to make cocktails, you know, these are some things you can kind of easily pick up at, you know, Target or Walmart, or kind of where you can order them online, or kind of whatever. There's really just a couple of things. Is you need one of these. This is called a jigger, and it's just standard measure. This one is 2 ounce and 1 ounce on the other side. They sometimes come in 1.5 ounces or 3/4 ounces. It just kind of depends. It's all the same. You have a strainer. You don't actually need a strainer. This is after you're mixing or shaking or something like that. It's just so the ice doesn't pour into the to the cocktail glass. But you can use, if you want to mix in a mason jar, you could use the top of the mason jar just to keep the ice out or something like that. And then you need a mixing glass. This is a nice fancy one that's actually my wife's. Don't tell her. But I've stolen for today. But you could use a glass. We used to use a vase that we got from the dollar store because it was nice and tall and long and stuff like that. So that's very easy. And then you need something to stir with. This is a nice long cocktail spoon, so you can, you know, mix it around, but you could just use a normal spoon or something like that. So I'm going to make just a very quick cocktail here. I'm going to make an old fashioned. That's just basically it's bourbon, or you could use rye if you wanted to, and then it's sweetened with a little bit of syrup. I have some fancy syrup, which I'll talk about in just a second. And then to give it a little bit more spice is that oftentimes you put in a little bit of something called bitters. I have Angostura bitters, and we'll add that as well. This is stuff you could buy this at the grocery store. These are Angostura bitters right here. Okay, so let's see if I can do this without pouring whiskey all over my computer. We're in uncharted territory right now, so I'm going to move my keyboard a little bit. Okay, so to make an old fashioned, I should probably tip this down a little bit. So no, that would be weird because then you'd be looking at my crotch, and I don't want that. So so I'm going to keep this right here and just pretend. So it's 2 ounces of bourbon, or 1.5 ounces of bourbon. We have some larceny here. There it is right there. I'm going to pour that in the mixing glass. And then the syrup, I have some kind of fancy vanilla syrup, which is just locally made, women owned by in a little town near here. But you could use what's often used as simple syrup, which sounds fancy, but it's really not. It's equal parts sugar and water. You warm it up just until the sugar dissolves in the water, stir it around, let it cool down, put it in a bottle, put it in your fridge. Simple syrup. Ta-da. And in a pinch, you can actually just use warm water from the tap, pour some sugar in it, and just shake it a lot until it's there. So I don't recommend that, but you could do that too. I don't like putting sugar packets in drinks, but some people do, but that's another
Some
thing.
people do like sugar cubes, but I prefer simple syrup in my old fashioned.
They do. In an old fashioned, I mean, like it's sweetened to taste. I use about 1/4 ounce or something like that. Some people try to do 1/2 ounce. It'll make a much sweeter drink. But it's just kind of whatever you prefer. And then a dash or two of the Angostura bitters. That'll just give it a little bit more spiciness, which I kind of like. So, all right. Then you stir it, and what the stirring is going to do is obviously just kind of cool down the room temperature drink, the room temperature spirits, but it's also going to dilute it just a little bit. You can do it without ice and just kind of put it in the fridge, but it is actually a little bit better. And then it's just about 15 to 20 seconds. I haven't been counting, so I'm just going to guess that I'm about done. And then you strain it with an old fashioned onto a nice large ice cube. And then, since we were sponsored by Uncle Nearest yesterday, I have a nice Uncle Nearest glass, which I like. I like these heavy bottom glass just because it has a little heft. And so cheers, Varsha. Cheers, everybody.
Cheers.
Yeah, that actually turned out really well. I was so nervous about doing this. I practiced it like 3 times in front of my computer because I was so convinced I was going to pour something everywhere. I am not a good cocktail maker, at least with mess and stuff like that. So that's what we're drinking. We're very excited to, I think, to take some questions. We have one more wonderful thing I think we want to talk about first before we get there. I mean, we could probably rant about what's going on in the world for hours, but instead of that, because this is the holiday special, we wanted to offer some gift suggestions. We talked about the drinking part, so now we're going to talk about the history part, and we each have a couple of books that we're going to suggest. And I'm going to put a link in the chat and send it to you. Is that we've curated through bookshop.org, which supports independent booksellers. It's an online retailer. Through bookshop.org, we have a Drinking with Historians list, both of all the books that we're going to talk about tonight, but all the books that have been authored by all of our guests, all of our 23, 24 guests that we've had over the course of the episode. And we'll continue to add that. So if you want to bookmark it, and if we ever talk about a book on the show, you can go and find out more about it there. So I'm going to pop that in the chat. Varsha, do you want to go first and talk about the books that you have?
So I am going to suggest people, you don't have to buy all 5, but if you're looking for a gift for yourself or for a bunch of, a friend or something or family member, these are the 5 that I would suggest. So the first one is a book that I recommend to basically any undergraduate, but also basically any person I see on the street that wants to accost me about systemic racism and how they don't believe in it. This is the book for that person. But this is also a book for people who genuinely want to learn more about American history. So this is a book about redlining, right? It's called The Color of Law. It's by Richard Rothstein. And even though it is, an academic book, anybody can read it. So I think that's why I think it's a great book for basically anyone. And it basically tells us the story of redlining and how African Americans have been generationally screwed over by the American state. And it's a really good book to sort of understand not just the housing crisis today and how we got to where we are today, but how, when you're thinking about the crisis of the pandemic, one thing that not a lot of people think about is they think a lot about dealing with rent and dealing with mortgage payments and dealing with evictions, but you don't think about how systemic racism and that type of oppression plays into it. And this book basically helps you understand that. So this is why I would recommend this book. That's the first book I would recommend. The second book is I got this as a gift ages ago by a friend of mine who is a French history grad student at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. I'm pretty sure that's where she is. It's called In Defense of the Terror. And it's a really short book. And it's by Sophie Wanek. I think I'm pronouncing that correctly. And basically, it's a really fascinating look into why the terror is actually about, pushing against illegitimate power. And so it's a really interesting look at the terror. And the reason I'm recommending it is the French Revolution was my first love back when I was 14. And for 5-6 years, I knew I was going to study the French Revolution. Obviously, I've shifted since then, but that's why I'm recommending it. Yes.
Why 14? I think you've said this, but in fairness, during these episodes, I have been drinking a lot, so I don't remember. So
yeah. So
what happened at 14?
So back when I was in 9th grade, I was at Arcadia High School. And Arcadia High School, they don't have AP Euro for 10th graders. They have a regular world history class or a modern world history class for 9th graders. And so we started studying something called the French Revolution. And Mr. Panza was our teacher. He was the best teacher at that school. He starts lecturing about the revolution. We get to Louis XVI's execution. And he tells us that, not only have these people attempted to overthrow, a centuries-long monarchy, but the people in the front row of the Place de la Revolution, which, they've completely overturned Paris. Women have marched to Versailles, everything. People in the front row could feel Louis XVI's blood on their faces after he was executed, as his head fell into the basket. And I was the only person in class at 14 years old who audibly said, "That's awesome." I don't think I said that's fucking awesome, but I do think I thought it. And from that moment onward, I was obsessed with the terror. And then I got even more obsessed with, because then in 10th grade, I actually took a European history class. And I got obsessed with French history because it seemed to me that every 20 or so years, these people were having a revolution. So there's the French Revolution, there's Napoleon, there's 1830, 1848, then there's the Paris Commune, and then it takes a long time until you finally get to the Fifth Republic. So I was obsessed with French history. So when I finally got to college, that's what I thought I was going to study. And after a while, I decided, no, I think everyone and their mother has written a book on it. I might need to move on. But this book is still really good. It's a really short book, and I think like anybody who is interested in the revolution or is interested in understanding the terror and you don't know a lot about it, it's a good book for anybody. So that's the second book I'd recommend. The next three books are hefty, but the thing is, I still think anybody could read them. It's just going to take you a while, but they're just like amazing books. Okay, so this is Robert Caro's The Power Broker. I only started reading this a week and a half ago, but I'm already halfway through it. It is that good. Oh man, it's that good. Okay, it's thick. She's a thick one, but it's that good. His writing is just amazing. And so basically, this is a really good book if you want to understand power and New York and how New York politics are completely messed up. This is just fascinating book on that. And it is a biography, but it's a great book. So I would definitely recommend this. If you are interested in American politics, I think somebody asked a question about American history. If you are interested in like understanding how, one American could influence a state or a city, that book is a really good book. This other book is obviously my favorite book, and I have to recommend it. It's Nature's Metropolis, William Cronon. So I read this back in grad school, not back in grad school, I'm in grad school, but I read this my first semester of grad school, and I was immediately obsessed. So people usually when they recommend Cronon's books, they recommend this one, but he actually, funny story about him, I found this out, he wrote a dissertation, which is his second book, Changes in the Land. So he had to wait he literally had two books in like his pocket after he left grad school. I don't understand how it happened, but yeah. And so like in some library in Oxford, I forget where it is, there's like an unpublished version of his dissertation, which is technically his second book. But this book is basically about Chicago. It is about how Chicago is the bridge from the east to the west. It's an environmental history of not just Chicago, but all of its surroundings. You basically get to obsess over grain and pigs and slaughterhouses, and it's fucking awesome. So this, you have to read it. And again, it is an academic book. It is hefty, but I have a friend who read it on audiobook, and he is not a professional historian, and he loved it. So I would recommend this. Last book, then I will give it over to Matt. Yeah.
Well, I do remember about William Cronon is that when we had Willa Brown on earlier, is that she mentioned she had met him, and I think you almost jumped out of your chair or like through the screen because you were so excited about that. So yeah.
He's on Twitter, but I don't think he uses Twitter a lot. But like, part of me really wants to email him and is like, "Hey, do you want to come on Drinking with Historians?"
Let's do it.
We should do it. We should.
Okay,
last book I would recommend. So I read this again, first semester of grad school, or maybe I read it maybe I read it after that. But basically, this is a book about the U.S. Constitution. It's by Michael Klarman. It's called The Framers' Coup. There's another book by one second. If you are interested in why basically whatever high school told you about the Constitution is a lie, these are the two books that I would read to understand the Constitution and to understand how we got to the Constitution. So this one is a newer book. This is by Pauline Maier. It's Ratification. You don't have to buy this one, but it's just a great book. Pauline Maier sadly passed away, but she's an amazing historian. But this book basically sort of like reinvestigates why we have the Constitution that we have today, specifically why we have this false idea about Jeffersonian Republicans versus Federalists or anti-Federalists versus Federalists. And it's a really good deep look into how we got the Constitution, right? And it has a really, provocative title. And that's really because the current historiography basically looks at the Constitution as basically a coup over what people actually wanted at the time. So, a lot of people for the longest time in high schools and in colleges, we understood Shays' Rebellion and the Articles of Confederation as like evidence of like a complete failure of the American experiment. Therefore, the Federalists and Americans who wanted a new constitution were right in saying we should have a new constitution. But if you look more into the documents, if you look more into the newspapers, if you look more into the actual constituencies, it's really an upper class group of Federalists who are interested, upper class group of New York, East Coast industrialists and Federalists who are interested in changing the Constitution and taking control, a little more of power, because the Articles of Confederation they split power among the states completely, right? And the federal government that the Federalists are proposing, it's a pretty strong national government, even at that time. So that's why I think this book is great. Okay, I've talked enough. Matt, you can recommend your books.
All right. So I am, as I say to my colleagues all the time, I'm a simple medievalist. Like I get like confused with things after 1400. So most of mine are going to be about the European Middle Ages. One of the things I will say about this is that the books I'm going to suggest primarily focus on kind of Europe, specifically Western Europe. That is an old kind of framing of the way the Middle Ages is. The book that I'm working on with David Perry right now is trying to broaden that, following in the footsteps of so many scholars before us who are trying to talk more about kind of what the global medieval means. Is that period really, does that period actually really mean something, and how interconnected and permeable the world is? And I think that kind of comes out in some of the books. So I'll go kind of chronologically, for lack of a better organizational scheme. The first book is, so I wrote my dissertation on this guy called Charlemagne, who was an emperor in the 9th century. I was particularly interested in, however, is in the memory of Charlemagne, the legend of Charlemagne that develops in the centuries after. And I wish this book existed in my time. It's a book called King and Emperor by Janet Nelson. This is a preprint copy, because I got sent that, but it has a different title, but it is widely available. It's a chunky boy. But it's written absolutely beautifully. It's a biography too, but it really, I think, like you were talking about with the Carroll book, I think we have sometimes, both historians, professional historians, and also kind of the general public, we have these kind of stereotypes of what biographies are. They think of them as kind of quasi memoirs and stuff like that. Is that this is like a detective novel. It's just like, what do you do with this 9th century, this 8th and 9th century figure who we really don't know a whole lot about? How do you construct a life of that person? Especially when their particular actions and ideas were so hugely influential on the shape of Europe. I mean, Charlemagne constructed an empire that rivaled Rome at its height. That was kind of the largest thing that had been seen for several hundred years. And Janet Nelson, recently, retired a few years ago from King's College London, does this absolutely amazingly. So that's number one. The next one, again, going chronologically, is got to talk about the Vikings if you talk about the Middle Ages. And so this is one I'm reading right now. There's a bunch of books out there. It's called Children of Ash and Elm by Neil Price. And it is phenomenal. It's again, I love history books that are written that are scholarly, but are so accessible and just written like you just can't stop. And there have been times like I usually read like these pleasure reading. I do it right before bed, and I will have to literally just make myself put it down, or else I won't be able to teach the next day because I'm just going to be too exhausted. I'll be happy to talk about Vikings, but it'll be kind of incoherent because I won't have had any sleep or anything like that. So Children of Ash and Elm. The Vikings are not like the History Channel, so read more about them. They're way more interesting. David Perry, one of our guests, again, my co-author in this book project I'm walking about, they rode camels. Did you know that? I bet you didn't know that. Well, you probably did know that. But anyway, they rode camels, like they traded everywhere. And again, the Vikings are really interesting too because of their vectors of permeability. They moved everywhere. They did everything, mostly killing, but they did kind of go all over the place. All right, from there, and then another research interest of mine, I'm interested kind of generally in these issues of religion and violence, and so I talk about the Crusades. And so I have 2 books on the Crusades. The first is an absolutely phenomenal, very short little book just called The Crusades, an Epitome. It's by Professor Susanna Throop, who's at Ursinus College. It's an absolutely amazing book. It's also a wonderful book because you can buy, and I encourage you to buy the small kind of bound copy, but it's free open access online. So if you're teaching about the Crusades, if you have to talk about the Crusades in a high school class, in a college class or anything like that, it's wonderfully written. It's rigorous scholarship, and it's free on the web. So you can just send students to that without having to burden them with buying things. But if you want to buy one for yourself, it's a really wonderful book. It's a survey of kind of the entire kind of medieval crusading phenomenon. So it's not going to go into depth on any kind of individual detail, but it's a phenomenal introduction to the topic. And then the other book on the Crusades is by a guy by the name of a friend of mine, by Jay Rubenstein. It's called Armies of Heaven. This is just about the First Crusade. So the creation of the Crusade movement in the late 11th century, and then what happens to the Franks as they march to Jerusalem and massacre people along the way. The framing that he uses is about the idea of the apocalypse and how that motivated action. the other thing that I love about it, it reads like an amazing mystery novel, is that it's one of those things that has punchy short chapters. The prose is wonderful. It's so evocative. You can almost like hear and smell and see things as these people as these things are happening. And I just absolutely love it. I've probably read it about 6 times. So it's really amazing. And then last but not least, it's a little bit denser book, but I can't emphasize how important this book is. It's called The Black Middle Ages, and it's by a professor by the name of Matt Vernon, who is at UC Davis. And what he talks about here is actually not the Middle Ages themselves, but about the memory of the Middle Ages, specifically thinking about the 19th and early 20th century. He talks about kind of the Harlem Renaissance. He talks about period before that, about how Black Americans thought about the medieval period in a time in the late 19th, early 20th century that was kind of rife with nostalgia for the Middle Ages. And we oftentimes think about this, right, with the Knights of the Ku Klux Klan, with the antebellum period of this idea of kind of Southern male chivalry, right? This evocative image of what the Middle Ages were, this agrarian economy with a landed gentry and a natural hierarchy, right? Which was enforcing white supremacy, and how Black Americans were writing back against that by thinking about the Middle Ages and claiming this justifiably for themselves because they were a part of this conversation as well. It's an absolutely phenomenal book. He has stuff on here on W.E.B. Du Bois that is just, oh, it's so good. It's just a phenomenal book, and I can't recommend this enough. It is dense, but it is worth your investment to talk about, and it'll get you into kind of all sorts of modern stuff that deals with the Middle Ages as well. So those are my 5 books. Again, all of these books we talked about, they're in the link on the bookshop.org link as well. So I think that's it for our recommendations. Should we take some questions now, Varsha?
Yeah, definitely.
Excellent. So please, again, if you have questions, put them in the Q&A, and we'll get to as many as we can. I mean, this is going to be kind of a free for all for the next 28 minutes. I'll start drinking heavily, and so we'll just see what happens.
We'll just see what happens.
All right.
I think one of the first questions I think is for me. Carrie asked, "What's the one book you recommend to an English expat who wants to learn more about American history?" So, besides the heavy ones I recommended, I think a really good short one is, it's Eric Foner's "The Story of American Freedom." It's a really short book, and it's just a really good overview, not of American history, but of like the ideas that are prevalent in American history, which is basically freedom as an idea, liberty and freedom as like the core ideas in American history. So if you're interested in why we're obsessed with that type of stuff, and you want to read the work of like one of the most important historians of not my generation, but the generation before that, this is a great book. Any of Eric Foner's books are great, but this is a really good short overview. That's what I would suggest.
We've had a number of questions about what's coming for 2021. And so I think we should talk about that. The short answer is we're not really sure. I mean, I think like Varsha and I we're, as with anything dealing this fucking pandemic, is we're just trying to get through things. So we were thinking about like, let's get to December and then we're going to reassess. But now that we're in December, we have actually started talking about this, and I have to say, like, I don't want to spoil things but we're going to have an announcement on the email listserv, I think tomorrow, if I can get myself to do this tomorrow, about a really exciting opportunity that's coming up. And then we have started to briefly talk about kind of guests for 2021, and we're batting things around. I don't want to say any specific names or right now because we haven't confirmed everything, but we are going to start up again in January. Because for both of us, our semester is going, and we'll probably stay with the bi-weekly format and things like that. One of the things we love to talk about kind of jokingly is a live event, like in person with like human beings at a bar someday. So
that would be so cool.
Exciting to think about. And the other thing too, which I think we've talked about too, is just to try to diversify the types of areas we've covered. Like a lot of the focus, for very understandable reasons, because of our expertise, because it's just the people we know, has focused on kind of Europe, on modern American history as well, especially kind of with larger people with larger Twitter followings and things like that. But I think we're really interested in getting more voices on the show as well. As long as they're not scared off by the previous episode and how loud.
Yeah.
sometimes. So,
for example, like I would really love to find historians on Twitter or not on Twitter who are interested in talking to us, who work on Latin America and African history, just because I know nothing about that. But I do know that there are like a ton of people out there, people who are professional historians and those who aren't, who would be interested in hearing about that. So that's why I'm excited for January. But I agree with that. We're just trying to get through. But I do think we've been getting through pretty well, and it's primarily because of drinking with historians. So
I think so. I mean, I think it's. I mean, there was a joke on Twitter. What was it? That said the spike in alcohol sales during the pandemic like really took off when drinking with historians. I don't want to take entirely. I don't want to take full credit for that, but I mean, correlation sometimes
yeah,
is causation. So I'm just saying.
definitely. So Sarah has a really good question. You can answer it first and I'll answer. When archives are going to be reopened again, what is the first place you're going to for research?
Oh, how much time do you have? All right, so I'm gonna try to very quickly narrow down the multiple places that I go. I will say I've done a lot of my archival work when I've looked at manuscripts, for example, is in London at the British Library, but also in Paris at the Bibliothèque Nationale. I think although there are manuscripts I would like to look at both in Barcelona and in Rome, I think I would go back to Paris. I think there's such and if anybody has worked in a French archive, you will know exactly what I mean. But there's such a weird, alienating and yet endearing way that you have to engage with the archives there. That it's just so delightful. It makes the end of the day when you go to get a drink or you go to get a coffee or something like that in the middle of the day, it's just so relaxing and rewarding because of the kind of high tense stress that you work up. And then you have amazing stories to tell about your experiences there that you can kind of share with others. And people who don't work in French archives, they think you're just kind of making this up. And then anybody who's worked in a French archives is like, oh yeah, that makes perfect sense. They would do that, or they would say that to you or something like that. So I would say I would go to Paris. I would either work both at the either at the Bibliothèque Nationale, which is the Richelieu. They have two campuses at the Richelieu, which is in central Paris, or there's a smaller archive which I really deeply love on the right bank called the Bibliothèque Mazarin, where I've done some archival work before, and they actually have a lovely manuscript collection there too. So I think it would be Paris if I had to pick one place right now. So what about you, Varsha?
Okay, so this is a controversial choice because even though I work on South Asia and the US, the first place I would go to is not India. I would go, even though, it's been a while, I would go to the World Bank archives. So the thing is, the World Bank archives, that they're hard to work with, but they're amazing. Like it just has everything that the World Bank has ever done. And if you take a little bit of effort, you can request so many amazing files. But on top of that, you get to be in DC. And unlike most of DC's residents, I love DC. I'm like obsessed with DC. DC is like, it's designed really well. I enjoy the metro. I enjoy the fact that like the World Bank cafeteria is great, but then I can leave the World Bank offices and then go to like a ton of different restaurants. There's amazing bars. I love DC. So that's where I would go to. However, the second place I would go to is a place I've never been before. I would go to Princeton, New Jersey, not for the sights, but because University of Princeton has David Lilienthal's papers. So David Lilienthal was the head of the TVA, and I work on dams, and I've never seen his papers. So he ran his own consulting company, and then before that, he was the head of the TVA. He also worked in atomic energy. So like this dude has done it all. So I would love to see his papers because it fits in a lot with my research. But I think DC is like the first place I would go to. And then the final place I'd go to if I get the time and if the pandemic dies down is New Delhi. I haven't been to New Delhi in 6-7 years. The last time I went, my purse got stolen on a train, but I still enjoyed it. I haven't been to the archive, but the New Delhi has two archives. It has the Nehru Library and the National Archives. But the thing about New Delhi is that it's right next to Old Delhi, and Old Delhi is it's beautiful. It's beautiful. And so if you have to visit like two places in India, I'm very basic. I'm not a great Indian. If you have to visit two places in India, the two places I would visit are New Delhi and Kolkata. Kolkata and New Delhi, like they encompass all of India for me. They encompass all my memories for me. Those are the two places I would visit. So that's my choice for archives.
I was just thinking, because I've heard so many stories, like, are you even a historian if you haven't been mugged while you've been in an archive? Like, I mean,
basically, right? So yeah, but the thing about India, even if you do get mugged, like it's a gorgeous place. Don't go during the summer. I've only been able to visit India during the summers, and it's incredibly hot. So if you're not used to the heat and the humidity, you're not gonna like India during the summer. But besides the potential for danger, India is a great place to hang out and to visit. Yeah. So talking about India, Chris has a really good question for. I think it's for me. He asked me what I think about Ramachandra Guha's Histories of Modern India. So I haven't read his most recent book, which is about Gandhi before he came to India. But his first book is called India After Gandhi. And that's one of the first Indian histories I read. And so it's not beloved by the Academy, even though Ramachandra Guha is an amazing environmental historian and a great historian. But India After Gandhi is a great book. So if you're interested in something it hasn't been covered a lot in the Indian historiography, because a lot of South Asian historians are really invested in the story of decolonization and the end of British colonization. So they're, really into the 1940s. They don't really go into the 1950s, but that's also because the archives haven't been opened up until recently. So India After Gandhi looks at what happens after India's constitution is created, after India is independent. And I think it goes well into the present day, at least back to when it was published. And it's a fascinating book. If you want an introduction to India, definitely read Ramachandra Guha's book as like an intro, right? It's a great book. I would recommend it. I know not a lot of other people recommend it, but I love it, Chris.
Yeah. So there's a question by, I think this is an absolutely fair question, because we subject our guests to this all the time, and so we should answer it too, is Bethany asks, what pop culture phenomenon related to our fields kind of annoys us the most? So, and I'll be happy to start, and then Varsha, since you just answered the last question, is I have to say it's the Nazis. I don't like the Nazis who really are into the Middle Ages nowadays, and they're really into the Middle Ages. There's been a ton of writing on this. I think pop culture related to the Middle Ages, like the Vikings TV series, the fantasy medieval, Game of Thrones, Lord of the Rings, like kind of all that stuff. I love it. I mean, I think it's weird to me that people get wrapped up in kind of the historical accuracy of these types of things, because they're fiction, right? Like, I mean, there's dragons, man. Like, you could do whatever you want with those things. But then the frustrating thing kind of within that, again, other than the Nazis, kind of a more serious question, but I really do hate the Nazis, is the that the way that historical accuracy is deployed, right, is that it's not a big deal to have dragons, but if you had black people in the show, that's not real for some reason, right? So it just kind of reveals how political these choices are, and how unconscious those politics, or at least how unconscious people kind of take those politics, is that seems to make sense to them, that they're making that type of argument without really thinking through that, what they're actually kind of saying. So I think trying to get my colleagues to try to work to unpack that, and there has been absolutely phenomenal work by people much smarter than me, much more dedicated in this, written much more interesting things than I could ever write about this, about why this actually really matters, and how it impacts kind of the way that we teach our classes and stuff like that. So I have to say, yeah. So again, that would be my answer. What about you, Varsha?
So this happens in TV shows, it happens in books, and it happens in like daily life. People just love to lionize past presidents, like they're larger than life, and that they work outside of history, and that just deeply bothers me. So like, to go backwards in history, the first president that everybody is obsessed with is Ronald Reagan. It's just like, he's lionized either explicitly or implicitly in a lot of TV shows. People love to misattribute quotes to him, and then they love to misinterpret the city on the hill quote, which Ronald Reagan himself misinterpreted. That's a long story that goes into Boston's history that I won't regale you with. But also this happens with not just Ronald Reagan, but also JFK, FDR, Teddy Roosevelt, Abraham Lincoln, George Washington, Thomas Jefferson. Basically, we're obsessed with lionizing these leaders as if they, not only didn't have help in the decisions they make, but also as if every decision they make was completely justified, right? And then we basically take away the fuller context of the history. And this happens in TV shows when, like, if you ever watch a political TV show like Madam Secretary or Designated Survivor or The West Wing, they'll give you a historical example to make the speech sound really good,
Yes.
but it's completely out of context. And it deeply bothers me because as somebody who works, technically I work in diplomatic history, and I don't just look at presidents though, right? So I'm looking at other people who are making decisions. I'm looking at actors who didn't have political positions. And so I think that's what really bothers me about the way we talk about our leaders, is that they are talked about as if they're outside of history, by people as well as in our TV shows and in our books.
Do you think that's kind of a holdover of kind of the great man of history kind of way of thinking about things, which is still so prevalent?
It definitely is, right? Because I think people just really, and I don't think this is the fault of one group of historians or a historian particularly. I think it's just a fault of how we like to solve our problems. We genuinely think like one person or a group of people can save us out of this misery, right? We're looking towards hope, and we put a lot of that hope into one person. So, for example, again, I don't mean to speak ill of our former president, President Obama, but like everybody put in a lot of hope into his first term and then his second term. And then at the same time, they put in a lot of hope into him speaking out or whatever over these past 4 years. But if these past 4 years have taught us anything, it's that one person does not have that immense amount of power to change the course of history, right? For example, if you look at even today, right, the Supreme Court rejected Texas's lawsuit. And so 3-4 weeks ago, before the November election, I was genuinely worried that Trump was going to be able to convince the Postal Service as well as the Supreme Court to be on his side to basically rig the election for him. And obviously that didn't turn out to be the case. That doesn't mean people shouldn't have been scared or people shouldn't still be scared about corrupt institutions. But it does tell us that one person doesn't have complete control over the direction of history. And I think when we tell stories about one person having complete control or having insight that other people don't have, it frustrates you, because then you're told the real story later on, and it's scary.
Yeah, and I think that's a really interesting point. And it goes to a question, and I can't find it right now. I'm sorry, I was scrolling through the Q&A. Is somebody asked about like what is it something that we've learned about the historical profession during this? And it's not necessarily something that like didn't occur to us before, didn't occur to, like, I think doesn't occur to professional historians, but it really reinforced is the fact that history is so contingent. Is that what I mean? Is like you were talking about, is like it could have turned out very differently than it did. And that means like literally anything that we talk about in the past. Like it didn't have to happen the way it did. And so, and oftentimes the way that history is kind of written, because it's written as a story, right? It's made to feel inevitable. And so we feel sometimes that the way we are right now, or the way that the event we're talking about in a historical book or an article or kind of on a TV show or whatever, like it's necessarily that the only way it could have turned out was that way. And that's really not the case. That's absolutely not the case. Is that there are a million decisions that are made, a million contextual issues that are absolutely important, that could have shaped things in very different ways. And I think we've seen that in so many different contexts in both in our conversations, but also in the way that our guests have talked about. I mean, the way that Eric Rauchway talked about the transition in 1932. I mean, Kevin talks about the civil rights era, way back when. Like David Perry has talked about kind of the Middle Ages. Mary Rambaram Olm and Eric Wade talked about the medieval period. Like it's just like there are a million different ways, and like we sometimes do get caught up, even as professional historians, like when we're teaching or when we're talking about these things, is making it, I think, kind of misrepresenting about how not fungible, but how unclear the outcome of these things oftentimes are. So
Yeah, definitely. I think contingency is a big thing that I've learned about from the historians that we've talked to about, their books and their fields. But I think another thing that I've learned about my discipline over the semester, as I've been teaching online and doing drinking with historians, is how important updating pedagogy is. Right. And like pedagogy doesn't just, it's not stagnant. It has to be consistently updated,
Yes.
not just because new historians are creating
Yes.
new arguments, and not just because, technically the endpoint of history is moving at every year, as we learned from Manisha Sinha, who wants to, change the dates for the first history survey, US history survey.
Yep.
I think as I've been teaching online and as I've been talking to historians who are probably doing the same thing, you recognize that there are so many things that you couldn't do that you could do in person, but that you have to find new ways to do, and you have to find new ways to talk about. And so, as a historian, like updating my pedagogy has not just helped my research; it's also sort of helped how I think about the field. And sort of expanded how I think about what I'd want to do after I leave the PhD. So I think drinking with historians and teaching online has really made me reevaluate how I teach history.
Yes, yes. If someone teaches from either literal or metaphorical, kind of yellowed notebook paper because they've never
Yeah,
updated their lectures, like that ain't cool, man. Like
that
there
ain't
is
cool.
always something new to say, and that's absolutely right too. Is like this webcast has absolutely made me rethink my pedagogy, and like I'm going to totally redo my medieval history survey the next time I teach it, which is
Nice.
probably going to be next fall, like, and just incorporate different things, different viewpoints, like not just kind of the guests that we've talking about, but just the general approaches to history. And I think that's a really beneficial thing to me. And I don't know if I don't want to speak for you, Varsha, but is reading outside of my specific subfield, right? And
Yeah.
talking with people outside of my specific subfield. I'm very fortunate where I am. I teach at Virginia Tech, right, that I have amazing colleagues who work on all sorts of different things, and there aren't a whole lot of medievalists here, so I kind of have to find that intellectual community in different ways, and they've really challenged me to think about things in very different ways, and to reshape the way that I'm presenting things to incorporate these different ideas. I do want to. There's been a great question, and is by Christopher, who just posted this about is about fiction. Is do we read fiction? And again, like, well, I'll throw it to you, Varsha. Like, do you have any kind of fiction book recommendations that
Okay.
you're particularly fond of?
There
So
There are so many. I think if you're looking for fiction that informs your understanding of history, there's like two books that I recommend that I read, three books that I recommend that I read in college in history classes, or not in history classes, but somewhere in history classes. The first is Pere Goriot by Honoré Balzac. And it's set in late 19th century France. It's about like labor, and it's like super depressing, but it's amazing. Great book if you're interested in European history and fiction. Another book, Crime and Punishment by Dostoyevsky. I was assigned that in a history class, European history class. Oh man, that book. First of all, as like if I was an English student, that book like blew my mind. But even as a history student, it totally like changes how you think about everyday people in Russia during that period, right? And it's a great book. And then finally, if you're interested in France, again, this is another book that got me. I read this back in high school. So back in high school, I'm in 10th grade, obsessed with the French Revolution. The teacher, instead of teaching for like a couple of days, just decided to show us Les Miserables, the movie. She just like decided not to teach for a couple of days, and I was like, I'm fine with that. But I'm watching this movie, and I'm like, this is amazing. And then I realized, wait, this is a book. And by mistake, I check out the unabridged version of the book, and I was like, oh, this is a big book. But after reading Les Miserables, you like get a brand new appreciation for like the difficulty that it takes to like revolt against a state, but also the difficulty of like being a prisoner of the state. Like that book just has so many important political valences for 19th century France, but also just as as somebody with feelings, it's a great book. Those are the three fiction books I would recommend if you're interested in history fiction. But like obviously, I somebody asked if they have a good history of the future, and I don't have one. But I think my all-time favorite fiction series is the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy series. So if you're interested in like science fiction and comedy, Douglas Adams' The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, and then the 4 books that come after it, excellent books. What about you? Do you get to read fiction a lot?
I do, and I have colleagues who I talk to, good friends who just say like, I don't have time for that. I'm reading all day. I don't want to read fiction. Like, I don't know how they do that, because like I have to read something else, and that could be like some of these recommendations that I made earlier. They could be kind of more pop histories, and by that I don't mean that pejoratively at all. Like just more narrative, more kind of intended for a general audience. Like I want to learn about things that I don't know a ton about, and that's a really great way to kind of dip into that. But fiction too. Like I mean, I love great stories. I mean, I think that's one of the things, and that's been a bunch of questions too. Is like, how did we get interested, or how do you get people interested? Is I love really great stories. Like I want stories in which the ending is uncertain, or there's more that you could learn about those types of things. And so I'll make 2 recommendations. They're not things that I've read right away, but they will always be with me. The first is a book called Canticle for Leibowitz, which, because you were talking about kind of future histories, is that this was a book written, and the author's name just absolutely is out of my head right now. I could Google it right now, but I've had 2 drinks and I don't want to. So you could look it up. Canticle for Leibowitz. It's a history of written from the perspective of the future after some sort of collapse, and I won't spoil it for you if you haven't read it. But it's basically the world has entered a new Middle Ages, and so that's why a lot of medievalists are kind of introduced to it. But it's absolutely fascinating. It's just incredibly well written, because they're dealing with artifacts of the present world that they're rediscovering, and they're trying to piece together kind of what happened. And so it's a really interesting kind of meditation on what does it mean to do history? What are the stakes of that history? Because in the book, there are incredibly huge stakes for kind of how they figure things out and what ends up happening. That's a wonderful book. And then the other book, which is probably right now my absolute, and some people say they have like a favorite book, and I that's wonderful. Like my favorite book always changes like from time to time. So my absolute favorite book right now is Station 11 by Emily St. John Mandel, which I have read probably a dozen times. Like no joke. It is just an absolute, it's a post-apocalyptic book, but it's a different type of book, in that it's a different type of post-apocalyptic book because it's suffused with hope. Like it deals with all the terrible things. And there was a big joke going around because a lot of people for some reason started reading it in March and April, and it deals with a pandemic that kind of spreads very similarly to how things spread here. And then it goes very, very, very badly. Not that things haven't gone badly, but it goes much worse. And so most of the world is wiped out very quick. And that happens in like 20 pages or something like that. And then it's after that. Wow. But it's about a wandering troupe of Shakespearean actors in the post-apocalyptic society. And it's about the need to continue to do art, that art is important for human survival. That the motto that's repeated throughout the book is survival is insufficient, that it means more to live, and art and the humanities and beauty and things like that are just absolutely wonderful. It's just a wonderful, wonderful book. It's so engagingly written. I mean, you could read it in just a few days, and I can't recommend it enough. So those would be my recommendations. So.
I just remembered, just real quick before I ask another question or address another question, 2 other books that were really important to me. One that I read in high school was The God of Small Things by Arundhati Roy. So if you're interested in South Asia, Arundhati Roy is an amazing writer, and that novel specifically, like it just completely destroys you, but it's such a good book. And then another book is Lincoln in the Bardo. So I'm sure that everybody has read this book already.
Yes. How did I forget that?
So if you
that
haven't
scene
read this book,
when he's in the tomb with, oh my God.
It's so good. It's so
oh my
good.
God. Yeah. George Saunders. Wow. Okay. Yeah.
Okay. So the reason this book is amazing is because it's based on a true story. So Abraham Lincoln, right? Like this dude, super complicated, also got super depressed when his son died. And he would literally go to his son's like grave, dig him up and like hang out with him because he was that depressed. This is during the Civil War. And the thing is, I get it, but this book is basically about that. He's talking to his dead son, and it's a beautiful, beautiful book. And so if you're interested in like that kind of fiction, you have to read it. It's like an award-winning book, but also it's just really good.
It's wonderful. You mentioned Arundhati Roy, and that reminded me of another book which I absolutely love, which is Jhumpa Lahiri's The Lowland, which is one of her
Oh,
most recent books. It's about kind of a terrorist incident and then the kind of family fallout from those types of things. It's just, oh, it's just gorgeous and just absolutely
so good.
heartbreaking, but lovely at the same time. It's just wonderful. So I could talk.
Yeah.
We could do a
And then,
fiction thing, but then it would be drinking with fictional people, and then that'd be weird because
yeah.
then would it exist? I don't know. So
Yeah.
sorry.
Okay, so two last questions. One
Mm.
is if you could change, or if you could dabble in another, historical field that's not your field, what would it
Ooh.
be? So what would it be for you? And then I'll answer.
All right, so I'm conflicted about this. I know the answer, but I'm conflicted about
Okay.
this, and I'm going to reveal probably too much. But anyway, so my mom was a American history teacher, high school, middle school history teacher, an American history teacher, and so I, of course, never wanted to do anything with history because that's what mom did. So here I am. But at least I kind of got away from that, right? And I went way back in time to the Middle Ages. But one of the things that got me interested is she had, or my parents had, an American Heritage 2-volume set on the U.S. Civil War, and so I would be an American Civil War historian, and I will say that I'm cheating a
You're
little
such a
bit because
dad,
I
man.
actually
You're such a dad.
I am. Yeah. I mean, do you see this? Like, yeah, this is me, right? Like I'm surrounded by Christmas decorations, and so yeah, so but it's actually this is a little bit of a cheat, and what I'm saying is that actually American Civil War historians and medieval historians have a lot to talk about because the ideological and especially the religious motivations of the people who were involved and the political crises that precipitated a lot of the societal turmoil that happens in the 1850s, 1860s, and then in particular periods, I'm thinking like the 840s, for example, in the medieval period, are absolutely similar. And I actually organized a conference about a year and a half ago, which was a comparative conference, U.S. Civil War and the Crusades, and I was flooded. Like it was just supposed to be this little small conference, and I was flooded with people who were just like, "Yes, this absolutely makes sense to us." But and to have Americanists and medievalists talking together was absolutely phenomenal. So I would say the U.S. Civil War, and I think that there's a value in those people talking together regardless. So sorry, Varsha.
Yeah. Okay, so I
You
would
can't say French
even if
Revolution because you said that
I know
earlier.
I can't say French
Okay.
Revolution. So even if I had to like abandon America and South Asia tomorrow, I would still be deeply interested in water. But the region I'd be interested in is I would be interested in looking at Latin America and Africa as like separate regions, but and as
Mm-hmm.
separate countries obviously within these continents, but specifically how they interact not with the United States but with the West, because the countries in Africa, like South Africa, Ghana, Kenya, as well as in Latin America, there's Argentina, Chile, Brazil. They all become not obsessed, but they all become interested in building dams and developing their nations, not to achieve the same status as the West, but to basically escape from the clutches of the West. This is during the Cold War and after the Cold War. And if I had to change my specialty tomorrow, I would be a Latin Americanist or an African historian. It would be really difficult because I haven't taken a Spanish class in, I think, a decade now, but I would love it. Mainly because in Latin America, there is another thing I'm really interested in is between countries, there are inter-country like water treaties, and so a lot of countries in Latin America share rivers or they share boundaries with the other people, and they basically share water. And so understanding how Latin American countries deal with that type of resource would be fascinating to me. And obviously the same type of crises happen in African countries as well, like between Egypt and other countries. So those are the two places I would choose. It would be my dream to be able to do that, but that's incredibly difficult.
Well,
Well,
I mean, there used to be these really cool NEH grants, which like for mid-career people who wanted to like fundamentally switch things. Now with the cutting of NEH budget, and God knows if it'll actually come back, I don't know if those still exist. So, but there's always time. I mean, the thing
there's
too
always
is
time.
like there's always time. Like I mean, like I have there's certainly plenty of examples we can think of wonderful historians who've done like amazing work after their retirements, right, is that they've just decided that this is something they want to do as they spend their older years, and they still publish and do really amazing things. So lots of time. So I mean, and you have many more years than I do. So.
Hopefully, as I've already promised Twitter, my second book, if I ever get to write a first book, my second book will be a global history of brown liquor. I vow upon it, because I'm fascinated with the fact that like it begins as Scotch and Irish whiskey, and then it comes to America, and then it goes to Japan, and like basically every single country has a version of it, and I'm obsessed with it. The business side and the cultural side. It's fascinating to me.
I'll tell you what, you write that book, I have a webcast that we'll interview you on. How about that?
Great.
All right. Unfortunately, we are running out of time. So from the bottom of our hearts, I mean, and I will speak for Varsha here, I just want to say thank you to you all for joining us on this adventure. I mean, this was launched, as we said at the very beginning, as we said before, just an idea, a Twitter conversation between still two people who have never actually met in person. But because of generous colleagues, because of all of you who are interested in learning a little bit more about the past, about just sharing your Friday evenings with some people and having a drink with them over the internet and trying to make something good out of this terrible situation we find ourselves in. Thank you so much for joining us throughout 2020 at the end of our 24th episode. Please stay tuned. Join our mailing list if you haven't already. We started finally a Twitter handle that you can follow just for this, at Drink Historians, all one word, on Twitter. And stay tuned for a very exciting announcement in the next couple of days about an opportunity. And we'll announce a 2021 slate as soon as we can. But until then, I just wanted to say thank you to everyone. And Varsha, do you have anything that I don't want to kind of monopolize? But
I just wanted to say cheers, and I just hope you all stay safe during the holidays.
Stay safe, wear a mask, don't get COVID, and